Coming up on this episode of The Close Read.
America has Nvidia, has the best chips in the world by a mile. China is not a peer competitor on a chip-to-chip basis, and it would be a long, long time, it seems, from all current information that they would be able to catch up.
Their competitor is Huawei, is that right?
Huawei, I'm sure they have a few other labs too, but Huawei is nowhere near what Nvidia can do. However, the U.S. has, as I've covered in CRB before, a deteriorating electrical infrastructure. The grid is in a bad way in a lot of ways, which we've all found out if we've been following the headlines for data centers. Where's this power going to come from? Just a few years ago, it was clear to me that we were struggling to keep the lights on with declining power demand, let alone increasing. So that's a huge challenge for us. China has the opposite problem, right? So they can't build the best chips, but they can and do have way more robust electrical infrastructure. They have power plants that are just waiting to turn online for something.
Hello, and welcome once again to The Close Read, your official podcast for the Claremont Review of Books. I'm your host, Spencer Klavan, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books, fresh off the exhilarating, still coming down from the high of the CRB's 25th anniversary gala dinner in New York. To all of you who showed up for that, thank you so much for making it an incredible evening. There will be some photos and some recollections, reminiscences from that event in the new issue of CRB. If you weren't able to make it, lots of great stuff there and just a wonderful reminder and way to celebrate being a part of this magnificent endeavor. So that's in the next issue. But for now, we are still we still haven't exhausted the riches of the summer 2025 issue. And we wanted to bring on a first-time guest of the podcast, not a first-time writer for CRB, but a friend of mine, Emmet Penney, senior fellow of the Foundation for American Innovation, contributing editor of Compact Magazine, and fresh off a number of real-life policy wins. Just saw him having an in-person conversation with the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, has been working round the clock to roll back some important regulations and moratoria on energy use, which he'll tell us more about, I think, when I bring him on. And so why don't I do that now? Emmet Penney, welcome to The Close Read.
Spencer, so great to be here. First time, long time. Excited to talk about this. And yeah, it was great to talk to Secretary Wright at our gala, which was last week. And that immediately followed a victory in Illinois. We finally repealed a moratorium on new nuclear that has been there for longer than I have been alive. So that felt like a big, big W for American energy dominance. Wow.
And yeah, I suppose that also means it's older. It's been there longer than I've been alive, too. So it's a bright new day. This should give our listeners, I guess, a sense of the areas in which you work, Emmet. You are interested in energy policy. You are a veteran of the left on this front, I think one might say. Somebody that was previously kind of in the environmentalist side of things, or rather the leftist environmentalist side of things, and became aware of some major flaws in that approach and have become instead more a champion of more sensible energy policy for the U.S. And we should also say we're here to talk about your piece in the CRB, Raking in the Chips, which is about Nvidia. And we'll get into what Nvidia is, but also Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia. And as the title suggests, it's about chips. So I'd like to start there. Every now and then, some news story, it becomes sort of the topic of conversation. And suddenly, all online commenters are experts in some field that nobody knew even existed until just recently. Most lately, it's been healthcare subsidies with the government shutdown. Suddenly, everyone knows about and totally has been tracking and didn't just learn that there are these Obamacare subsidies that might or might not be extended. A while back, as I recall, it was rare earth minerals, which I, on the American Mind podcast, at one point called raw earth minerals, which I think is
Nice.
something you like lie to your face if you are developing a skincare routine.
Yeah, you can pick those up at Erewhon, by the way.
Exactly. Right. Yeah, I hear that Gwyneth Paltrow has a line of them coming out. But this should give you some sense of my own previous acquaintance with the subject. But the reason everybody suddenly had to pretend that they knew what rare earth minerals were is because they are important, as I understand it, in the production of microchips. And microchips, in turn, are important, well, because they're part of computing everywhere, but especially now they are important for AI. And AI is perhaps the Mac Daddy of all things we just learned about overnight and suddenly have to be experts in. So I wonder if, for the benefit of our listeners and also a little bit for the benefit of me, you could walk us through in very kind of plain terms, just what is the microchip and why is it so important for computing, but also and especially for AI?
Okay, so I'll first start by recommending a little bit of extra homework for people who want to post about this, which would be Chris Miller's Chip Wars, where he does a masterful job of getting into the nitty gritty of what makes chip, how they're fabricated, things like that. What chip lithography is, that's also a very important part of this. We're not going to get into all that. So if you open up the back of your computer, you'll see the microchip that runs it. And if you were to rip it out and look at it under a microscope or something like that, what you would see looks like a very interesting lattice work of highway routes for electricity to move in a very fine-grained way. And this is how this chip modulates and computes, right? That's just, let's say, the most basic way to do it, or to explain it. Now, a CPU is linear and a GPU is simultaneous. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, luckily, Nvidia kind of explained that for us a little while ago. They brought Mythbusters, those two guys, onto one of their conferences, and they brought them on stage. And to demonstrate the difference, they had two different paintball machines paint a picture. Now, the one, to imitate a CPU, fired single pellets in a line and painted a smiley face in something like a minute and a half, right? So that's one problem after another that it is solving to figure out how to represent something. And then they had the imitator for the GPU, and it shot thousands of paintballs all at once and painted the Mona Lisa in, almost under a second. Right. So that's the difference, right? You have taking things one at a time and processing it, and then you have all at once simultaneity.
So the analog for this is, let's say you tell your computer, I want a picture, as we now can do, I want a picture of William Shakespeare as a robot. The CPU is going to figure out each pixel in succession or something like that. And the GPU is going to basically just fire hose that whole thing all at once. It has that capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. The amount of data intake and output is enormous. They each have different needs. The GPU was pioneered by Nvidia. Originally, it was something of a marketing category. It was like half marketing, half technical category. And eventually it became really its own technical category as Nvidia improved on these chips after the year 2000.
Okay. And this brings us to the main subject of your piece, which is Nvidia, another name that suddenly everyone knew when AI became a big deal, because they are what? The biggest, most successful stock in the country? Is that still true? And did I get that right?
I think so. It's their. So I was actually just checking Reuters before we hopped on, and because of the government shutdown, I believe I saw that. Don't quote me on it, even though I'm about to be quoted on a podcast on it. That there's a delay in some of our earnings data, et cetera, et cetera. But Nvidia is about to outperform both the S&P 500 and the entire tech stock category again. Right. So they're a several $trillion company that makes the most important piece of infrastructure, if we want to call it that, in the world.
And they have cornered the market on it via a fascinating gambit, which you describe in the piece, on the part of Jensen Huang, the CEO of this company, who is one of these sort of Steve Jobs or Elon Musk types, huge character, huge personality, massive ambition. And he had he had his own software that he was kind of letting people use until they could come up with something interesting that would then be both run on Nvidia chips and use exclusively Nvidia software. And that's basically what has now happened with these chips, right? Like you can only get them from Nvidia at the level that we need them to train AI. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll just give sort of a broad sweep of what happened. NVIDIA started off as a gaming graphics card computer. This was back in the 90s when no one really thought there was a big market in gaming. There weren't a lot of games. No one knew how big that market was. And NVIDIA said, well, we want to make chips for it because we just think that as computers, show up in more and more people's homes, this will be an increasing market vertical. So we want to be there for that. And their first two chips basically failed. Jensen Huang figured out that people didn't really care about elegant computing. They didn't really care about, chip size. Even what they wanted it to do was to be cheap and impressive in terms of what it got you with results. This is around the time 3D computer games started. The first gesture towards this was Doom, which came out of id Software, which was a huge seller and changed gaming entirely and was not compatible with NVIDIA chips. And then its successor to that, not Doom 2, but Quake, which was fully 3D, and boasted a soundtrack done by Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails. So it was hooked into the whole alternative culture movement that was happening in the 90s. So again, massively popular for these reasons, was also not compatible with their chips. And so NVIDIA had to figure out how to catch up. They did. You can read the piece to figure out how they did that. And I also recommend reading the books that I review. Credit to those authors. But that started to place NVIDIA ahead of everybody in this. And they started to gobble up competition. And Jensen Huang said, I need to create a moat because here's how disruption happens. There is somebody who enters the market that figures out how to capitalize on a market niche. And then that allows them to overtake incumbent competitors in their own verticals. Where the phrase disruption comes from is the Honda Super Cub, which was sold to the kids of CEOs who bought the cars from GM and Ford, et cetera. And that allowed Honda, by mastering the Super Cub, to figure out how to carry over those innovations into delivering automobiles. And it's almost one for one in terms of analogy for these chips. Incumbents like Intel, et cetera, were interested in selling computers, a whole stock to parents, whereas NVIDIA was interested in selling graphics cards to their kids. And Huang realized that there was sort of, a switch you could flip on the back of the GPU to allow it to do a different type of computing, and grafted this thing called CUDA, the actual what that acronym stands for escapes me now. But what is important about it is that it is a language and architecture that allows you to do a lot of that simultaneous computing that I described. And he sank billions into this, had to fend off a corporate takeover from it. But he was betting that if somebody created a watershed innovation with this technology, then because it could only exist on NVIDIA chips, they would create a permanent moat to wall them off from disrupting new entrants into their market. And that's exactly what happened, because eventually people started to do the machine learning that became AI on those chips using CUDA. And this was something that no one really foresaw in the way he did. It was a massive gamble that paid off. And it displayed the kind of thinking from first principles that he really debuted when he pulled NVIDIA out of the fire after its first two chips tanked, where he said, what are we doing here? What are the primary business principles? What are our technical advantages here? And how do we make it so that it is pretty much impossible to overtake us on this front? And so all of these data centers you see getting built by OpenAI or Microsoft or Google, they're buying from NVIDIA. And NVIDIA maintains its breakneck pace of debuting new chips. That is another thing that Huang is really insistent on. that they have a schedule of outperforming themselves, and they will sacrifice elegance. They will sacrifice clarity of code. They will allow things to be a little bit kludgy in order to maintain that edge. Right. So I think that's a really important aspect of what they're doing.
Right. Right. No, I mean, it's not quite move fast and break things or whatever the slogan was, but it's like keep your eye on the prize or something, and let some of the aesthetic elements fall by the wayside that might appeal to tech nerds. Because as you said, from early on, they discovered, well, okay, you can make this incredible chip, but most people who use a computer, like, this will be their first time hearing about how chips work, and it's never occurred to them to appreciate it except what it puts up on their screen. And this brings me to, I guess, the reason this piece is in CRB and not, say, the New Atlantis or some like Wired, right? Some tech focused outlet, because it's all very interesting and helpful what you're saying. Also, there is a major sort of American political dimension to this technology now. Like, it is a part of the trade wars that Donald Trump seems interested in pursuing with China. It is one of the, if not the major sector in American industry right now. And so we actually have this big national interest in figuring out what to do with it. I wonder if you could talk about Jensen Huang as an American figure. Like, what is his attitude toward these national disputes, separate from his attitude toward, I mean, obviously he has huge, voracious ambition to become internationally successful and has met those ambitions. But has he signaled at all, like, where he stands and how he feels about being now in this position of like having a major role to play in America's prosperity and future?
Yeah, at the time that the books were written and then this was starting to change as I was writing the piece, Huang had been very quiet politically. He wasn't really interested in this sort of semi-statesmanship that major CEOs often have to get into. He'd done a good job of avoiding that. He wasn't like, Elon Musk, who has been very, very open about his partisan fidelities and his political beliefs. Jensen sort of maintained an almost classical bourgeois approach to what he was doing, and embodies a lot of, I think, very admirable bourgeois values in his own life, including his marriage to his wife and his relationship with his children. Now, that's all to say that Huang is from Taiwan, immigrated here. Interestingly, sees himself as Chinese, not Taiwanese, and it's a very simple business calculation for him, I believe. He makes chips, so he wants to sell them to as many people as possible. China's got a lot of people in it. They have a lot of AI researchers in it. He wants to sell chips to them. Not everybody in America is stoked on that idea. And figuring out how to get the Trump admin on side with this has been his clumsy foray into this semi-statesmanship. He has lauded Trump a lot in the press. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the president responds to flattery. However, the AI race is almost perfectly dramatic in terms of the respective countries' strengths and weaknesses. So America has Nvidia, has the best chips in the world by a mile. China is not a peer competitor on a chip-to-chip basis, and it would be a long, long time, it seems, from all current information that they would be able to catch up.
Their competitor is Huawei, is that right?
Huawei, I'm sure they have a few other labs too, but Huawei is nowhere near what Nvidia can do. However, the U.S. has, as I've covered in CRB before, a deteriorating electrical infrastructure. The grid is in a bad way in a lot of ways, which we've all found out if we've been following the headlines for data centers. Where's this power going to come from? Just a few years ago, it was clear to me that we were struggling to keep the lights on with declining power demand, let alone increasing. So that's a huge challenge for us. China has the opposite problem, right? So they can't build the best chips, but they can and do have way more robust electrical infrastructure. They have power plants that are just waiting to turn online for something, which is why there was this big debate over whether or not there should be export bans on NVIDIA chips. Because if China starts to get just advanced enough chips from NVIDIA, they don't necessarily need the every 6-month update. They can string together a bunch of those and just plug them into whatever power plants they have laying around and start to catch up with us through brute force that way. Now, it seems that both the American political establishment and the CCP have responded to Jensen Huang in a similar way. The American establishment said, we're going to do export bans. There was an attempt at this under the Biden administration. NVIDIA got chips through just under the wire based on technicalities, but the Trump administration has pretty much unanimously decided that, we will take a 15% stake in your company. Who knows if that's legal? I'll let the courts decide. But we are not going to let you sell whatever to our peer competitor. China has responded in kind. And China has said, as of, I think, September, we are also not going to import NVIDIA chips. So it's been sort of wrecked on both sides for Huang. Now, how serious that is, I'm not a trade expert. I haven't looked into these situations like at full depth. So maybe there are caveats that allow them to figure out how to import. There's certainly a black market for NVIDIA chips in China. That is definitely true. But I think China is under the impression that, it can't compete right now, as it has done in so many other verticals, it can figure out how to compete in the medium term with NVIDIA. It will just take them time and discipline, which is something they seem to have in great abundance. So that's sort of the state of play now. I don't know where that leaves Jensen Huang. He would certainly like a rosier relationship between America and China because it would be good for his business and it would be good for his employees, most of whom have NVIDIA stock. But the NVIDIA stock seems to be doing pretty well regardless because of the AI boom.
Right. If that's what I was going to ask or perhaps observe, that the tremendous kind of eye-popping success of NVIDIA stock is taking place under all the conditions you just described, right? That's reflective of, even with a degree of hostility to kind of international trade between NVIDIA and China, or have those developments not yet made themselves fully felt for NVIDIA's bottom line?
I think that since there were already partial or attempted export bans underway, I think that those were more or less priced in for NVIDIA's valuation. Now, the question is, what NVIDIA's valuation would be sensitive to is our power supply problem, which is what every hyperscaler is sensitive to.
Yes. Well, this is my next question for you because, okay, I know this is that now we're really touching on sort of your great theme, and we've got limited time left. But if it's possible, can you tell me briefly why it is that China is so far ahead of us in terms of the grid? I mean, this is something that people, I think, know about. If they know about this, they know about it because Elizabeth Warren is always whining about how much water we need to do AI for some reason. But it is the case, right, that it takes enormous, massive amounts of energy to develop this technology. And one would expect America to be at the forefront of that capacity, but we are obviously not. Is that just because China doesn't care about the environment and they have a centralized government that can just pedal to the metal on this stuff, and we are like choked by regulations? Why is it that we are behind?
It's a combination of things. And so I'd say this. Let's start with China. What do they have in their corner? Yes, certainly they don't have to deal with NEPA problems, National Environmental Policy Act, which is sort of the permitting hell you get locked into if you want to build anything. And this happens at both the federal and state level. In fact, FAI, my employer, just debuted its scorecard for states. So if you're a state legislator and you want to know how to improve permitting in your state so we can build things, check us out. So China doesn't have to deal with that. China does have the benefits, however long they'll last. All songs end, no matter how good they are. Central planning, so they can just say, we're doing this. And I would say the other thing is that because they're an industrializing country that they have a great suite of engineers who are very capable of delivering this technology. Now, by which I mean power infrastructure. We have a great natural gas sector. We over-indexed on policies that support wind and solar, which is intermittent and non-dispatchable. Basically means you have to catch it when it shows up and you can't turn it on when you need it. So you have to build your system around that. And a lot of that has to do with our environmental madness. So let's just take, an example. I think, over 10 billion, maybe $15 billion has been spent on battery storage in California. And that's to offset the stiff peak of solar when it comes on and when it drops off, sunrise, sunset, right? So how do you make that more gentle? So you store some power in batteries to discharge during that. So that's a little bit easier, right? Well, all of the batteries that 15 billion has been spent on is equal to a single LNG terminal in New England called the Everett LNG terminal, right? So this is a massive misallocation of capital. And I am not an anti-battery guy. I just want to demonstrate that economies of scale and energy density are real. Now, all this stuff has some role to play in our grid, but we've sort of overemphasized the wrong things. And since about the mid-century, a lot of top engineering talent started to move out of the power sector, which used to be the cutting edge sector, and into things like electronics, microchips, aerospace, things like that. So there's a talent pipeline issue. And we've done a poor job of, I think, valuing working class jobs, manufacturing jobs in this country. And so there's a dearth of things like linemen and stuff like that. All the people who would build a nuclear power plant are building data centers right now. That's how thin the talent pool is, which is not to say the people that are working on all the stuff aren't excellent. It's to say that we don't have enough of them, right? And we also have these sort of abstruse power markets that take up 60% of the country. Those were sort of debuted in the 90s through Enron. If anybody remembers the California blackouts around 2000, that was sort of their debut in America. That's now 60% of the country. And the power markets pursue efficiency, which means stripping out excess. And this has meant stripping out, quote unquote, unneeded power plants. Unfortunately, when you need them and they're no longer around, it turns out they're very, very difficult to build. So that's where we are. We're in a power system that is very sensitive to the price of natural gas because that's 40% of our power generation, which means if we see the price of natural gas start to climb, we see things start to get more and more painful. And then again, just to reiterate, on the permitting end, we've made it very, very difficult to build anything. My colleague, our director of policy on the energy team at FAI, also has this great phrase called NEPA dark matter, which means industrial projects that are just abandoned before they ever get off the ground as soon as the project owners start to take a look at what it's going to cost them litigation-wise to get this project over the line. And we just don't even have a number for what that looks like, but we know it exists. That's why it's the NEPA dark matter. So we have a few things that America needs to figure out, which is what is industrial policy going to look like for things like nuclear power plants? This was something I talked to Secretary Wright about, and he's very bullish on. So there are a lot of exciting things happening there. And then we sort of have this brief window here before people start caring about their midterm elections to get permitting fixed where it is possible to build transmission lines and pipelines. And if we don't do that, then the clock starts over. And it's another 5-year wait until you get people who are amenable to these changes and the various committees that they will rise to after the midterms, right? So this is a very delicate time for the American power system, which will determine what the hyperscalers are like, how many chips Nvidia is going to sell to American hyperscalers, and where we're going to be in this AI race over the next 5 years.
The pitch here, I guess, would be if you want to have protectionism against China and you want to have this sort of escalating trade war, then that means you're not going to be able to take advantage of their power grid. They are fixing their deficit or trying to by forcing like more and more chip manufacture, basically, as they have done, as you say, in other areas. If we are going to lock ourselves down, but also compete, we've got to fix our deficit somehow, which is to say, get the grid.
Get more power. Yeah. We have, they have a more favorable, and they're, by the way, going to eclipse us in having the largest nuclear power fleet in the world.
Wow.
soon, probably within the next 10 or 15 years, unless we get our act together. And we've had it since the Atoms for Peace era under Eisenhower. So this is a long-term advantage that we have held, that we are about to surrender. And I should emphasize that China is building what is essentially a version of our national champion, the AP1000. And they are building it cheaper than we are. I find that kind of humiliating. They're slow rolling it too, because so people say, oh, but they're going to have accidents. No. To have an accident to them would be to lose the mandate of heaven. They are slow rolling what they are building, and they're still outpacing us there. So there's a lot of different other competing factors here. We obviously don't have the time to get into, but if we want a sort of a broad strokes outline of what the relationship between Nvidia, the hyperscalers, and our respective power systems are between China and America, those are the broad strokes.
Wow. So, okay, America's assignment is to get its act together with power, and your assignment, dear listener, is to go to ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com and read Raking in the Chips by Emmet Penney. There are so many good, there are so many helpful explainers in this piece, Emmet, and there are so many amazing anecdotes. We haven't even gotten to, you told some of them, but anyone who played any video games in like the 80s and 90s will love this piece. Anyone who wants to know in basic, like layman's terms, what the technology involved in that suddenly has changed our lives, this also can be yours by going to ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, and you will have to subscribe, which if you haven't already, but you're listening to this podcast, I really don't know what sort of life choices have brought you here, but you need to re-examine them and amend your ways. Emmet, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It was a great time, Spencer. Thank you.